Can't believe it's already the last talk of the day. This is the recorded one, so after the video has finished playing, I won't appear here anymore. So I hope to see all of you during the closing keynote of today. And of course, we'll be back tomorrow as well. So this talk is one by Austin Gill, who spent a year writing a series of articles that explored best practices of building HTML forms in terms of semantics, accessibility, styling, user experience, and security. And he wants to show you how to leverage those lessons with JavaScript to give your forms sort of superpowers without bloating your client-side bundles. So Austin also does a lot of open source. So if you know Vue Utensils as a project, that is his doing, and he live streams on YouTube and Twitch as well, hosts the Function Call podcast and speaks at conferences like here at Dev Days. So I hope you enjoy this talk and see you later.
Hey, how's it going? My name is Austin Gill, and you can find my information at austingill.com or on Twitter at HeyAustinGill. I am a developer advocate for a company called Akamai that does enterprise level CDN, web application firewall, cloud computing and hosting. And I have been hacking on websites for about 10 years. And these days I mostly focus on creating content to educate developers and help developers build better websites. So today we're going to be looking at building superpowered forms with JavaScript. So before we get started, the first thing I like to do is actually define, what are powers? What do we mean by powers, and what justifies or qualifies a superpower? So first, I like to set a baseline that just communicates things that the web and forms and the subject that we're talking about just kind of has inherently as just being what it is. So the baseline is HTML forms are generally semantic. They convey some sort of meaning. They work well with assistive technology. They work really fast. Security, yeah, HTML forms are pretty secure. I mean, there's ways to build them in ways that are not secure, but that kind of goes beyond the scope of what the browser is doing. And then there are a lot of features that the browser builds in for us just by using sort of the more basic underlying technologies that are built in. So taking that aside, we can look at ways that we can extend beyond just this baseline and get into more like superpower territory. And that's things like being able to do things that actually go above and beyond to improve the accessibility experience or improve the user experience, or maybe we add non-existent features that can make the forms even better. And we don't want to break anything that's in the baseline of features that are already existing. So let's look at a very basic example of doing something like this with JavaScript. We might have a div on our page somewhere, and we want to make sure that it can respond to some sort of click event. So we want to make it clickable. And we can do that very easily by tapping into the onClick feature and adding some sort of JavaScript function called handleClick. And we probably want to enable the same sort of functionality for users that are using a keyboard. So we want to have some sort of key down event handler as well. The div needs to be focusable, so we have to give it some sort of tab index so that users using a keyboard can hit the tab key and actually focus on the div so that then they can click it. And of course, you probably want to communicate to any users that could be using assistive technology and let them know that this is more than just a div. It actually has some sort of semantics. Now, this is all great, except that what started as just like a click handler has now required the addition of a lot of extra work and features. And if we're talking about some sort of click handler that might do something like navigate to a different page, we might even be missing some of the built-in features like right click and open in a new tab or control click. And lastly, all of this relies very heavily on JavaScript being available, which may not always be the case. And so this example kind of inspired this comic where we basically look at a button and an anchor link talking to each other, looking at a couple of planes flying by and making fun of all of the amount of work that they have to do to not even accomplish the same sort of features that these browser primitives have just kind of built in. And that that brings up what I like to follow as a good rule of thumb when building websites and building forms specifically, that HTML is awesome. It's a good place to start, and you should use the built-in HTML features as much as possible. Then it's a good idea to start introducing CSS to try and accomplish what can be done with CSS. And only once you've kind of gone through those two approaches, then can you start to introduce JavaScript. And that kind of introduces a question of what's wrong with JavaScript. And the answer is, well, there's a lot of reasons that it could fail. Now, a lot of people say, "Oh, how many people actually browse the web with JavaScript turned off?" Because you can disable JavaScript on your browser settings. But the reality is that there's a lot more opportunities for JavaScript to fail. And if you have something like a payment form or a sign-up form or some very critical action that has to happen on your page, you might want to make sure that it runs as reliable as possible. And so that sense of reliability and sort of working with HTML through CSS and up to JavaScript really comes to, or brings up this topic of progressive enhancement. You may have heard it before. It's basically this idea that you start with the most minimum viable product to actually work across the most amount of environments and devices and your users, and that would be like HTML. And then maybe under certain circumstances or context or what the user's device is, you can start to enhance based on what features are available on that device. But you start with the very basic and you kind of progressively enhance on top of it. So you can think of this sort of like ladders to stairs to escalators. And the reason why we're talking about ladders, stairs, and escalators is because someone made a really good reference to a Mitch Hedberg joke. He basically says that an escalator really can never break. It can only become stairs, which is brilliantly encapsulates the concept of progressive enhancement, because in the event that something like JavaScript fails, you can have it fall back to a working version that isn't quite as nice, but still gets the job done. So today we're going to start with just HTML, which we can sort of think of like the ladders. And we can look at HTML and assess its sort of strengths and weaknesses. So on the strength side, there's a lot of really nice things that HTML makes available to us just out of the gate. I mean, it's semantic and accessible just inherently on its own, although we can enhance that with other HTML features or other JavaScript features even. It's very performant. You download it. The browser doesn't actually have to use much resources once it's already parsed. There's not a lot of moving things floating around, so it works really fast. It also can have built-in features to make HTTP requests, both in the anchor link and in the form tag. And there's actually 24 different types of form controls that HTML has built in, including 22 of different types of inputs, and then you have the select tag and the text area. And on those inputs, since HTML5, which has been around for a very long time at this point, we have some built-in validation constraints that we can use with just HTML. HTML also has keyboard support, so if you want to provide a good experience for users that are using a mouse and or a keyboard, HTML is a great place to start. It has features like inherent submit, where just using a form and highlighting an input element, a text input, you can hit the enter key and it will submit the form. And lastly, and almost most importantly, it's extremely reliable and forgiving. I mean, it's kind of hard to write a bug with HTML, because even if you forget to include a closing tag, the browser will just be like, it's all right, I'll just throw that in for you. You can, of course, still write bad HTML, but it's a lot more forgiving if you do make a mistake. And that said, HTML has its weaknesses. When dealing with forms, there's a lot of inputs and a lot of elements that we don't have any sort of visual control over, and they may not fit great with our design aesthetic we're going for. There's also, a set of user UI and UX that users might be used to, which is great to lean into, but also depending on your application, there may be a better user flow that you can come up with. And lastly, although the validation support is great, and it's great to have the built-in validation, it kind of sucks that we can't modify the built-in UI. However, All those things aside, we have the strengths and the weaknesses. There are actually some built-in superpowers that we can add to our forms just starting with HTML. So for example, if you have a lot of users that are coming to your website on mobile devices, which I think the majority of the internet or majority of website traffic is on mobile these days, you can actually improve the experience for your users by tapping into the input mode on a input. So it's an attribute that exists on input tags. And this can modify which virtual keyboard pops up on their device when they're filling out that input. So it can be a really nice user experience improvement. Next, we can also make it a lot faster and easier for users to fill out forms. The browser might know a user's home address or credit card information, and we can make it easier by signaling to the browser that this input is eligible to be autocomplete by or auto-completed by whatever sort of input it should be. We also have a feature called autofocus, which can bring the focus of the browser into a specific input on purpose. And I have to caution against this one just because it only makes sense if the main purpose of your application is to submit a search form right away. So something like Google, that might make sense. But otherwise, don't just put autofocus on like the search field of your e-commerce website, for example. So just in HTML alone, there's a whole bunch of these sort of utility belt features that I like to point out, including we have all of the input types we can use, the different validation constraints, and those last three sort of superpowers that I mentioned. And that's just starting with HTML. There's also a couple of blog posts that I have written that go into more detail about semantics and accessibility and how to create forms and inputs that have the proper labels and why one approach versus another, but a little bit too much information to get into today, and I just want to focus on the sort of strengths and weaknesses and superpowers stuff. So next, what we can do is start sprinkling in some CSS. And this is where we take the concept of that ladders and we start to enhance it and make it more like stairs, which can be a little bit easier to work with or a little bit more beautiful. So with CSS, we have these strengths and weaknesses. So for example, the biggest strength of CSS is that it gives us the ability to start creating designs in our application and having some sort of unique aesthetic or something that's like branded to our company's website or that. And that applies to forms as well. And CSS is also very fast. It doesn't take up a whole lot of resources in doing things unless you there are ways to make the browser do a lot of work with shadings or gradients that are moving and a whole bunch of stuff. So you can do it poorly, but kind of by default, CSS is relatively fast. It downloads, it parses, and then it just kind of gets out of the way. It's also can be considered a Turing complete language if you account for CSS plus HTML plus maybe user input. And it's extremely reliable. Once again, it downloads and it just kind of parses in the rendering phase, and then it's just ready to go. And it can also be very forgiving when you write mistakes in CSS. The browser can just pretend that property didn't exist where you wrote the mistake and just move on to the next thing. It's not going to throw up its hands and stop parsing the rest of the file. So it's a pretty cool language. That said, it does have its fair share of weaknesses. So for example, whether you consider CSS a programming language or not, or whatever, it's not as dynamic as some of the other languages available. So it's kind of like a sort of static, what you ship to the browser is kind of it, unless you use a different programming language like JavaScript to modify some things. Also, it's very heavily dependent on the HTML that already exists on the page. So you they kind of go hand in hand together, and you have to have a little bit more tight coupling between the two. And because of this tight coupling and the fact that CSS can be quite powerful, some of those sort of powers require doing things in kind of a hacky way that it's not necessarily intended to, even though it can be done. So you have to be careful about what you're doing and what the intention is and what's capable and sort of balancing that. And last, even though CSS is quite powerful and designed to make the website beautiful and be able to modify the looks of a whole bunch of different elements, it still can't break through things like browser native validation UI. And that can be kind of a pain in the butt, especially if you spend a lot of time creating a beautiful bespoke website and then you have kind of these ugly validation pop-ups. So with all those considerations, there are some superpowers that we get just from introducing CSS alone. And that is we can make the existing inputs that are accessible and work well and have all the benefits of HTML, and we can customize them to look beautiful as well so that they can be more bespoke and fit into our applications. We can also do things these days like that used to require JavaScript, but now we can accomplish with CSS, such as taking a child element that is interactive, such as an input, and when it receives focus or it's checked or it has some sort of state that has modified it, we can extend that to affect parent components all the way up the tree to the root of the DOM. There's also some level of input validation sort of hints that we can do just with CSS, which is very nice. And there's kind of a cool and interesting way to do conditional rendering that once again was dependent, or used to be dependent on the realm of JavaScript, and now is kind of getting transitioning over into CSS abilities. So here I have an example of custom radios and checkboxes, and you can see here that as I check them, they look different than what the native, I'm in a Chrome-based browser, and these look different than what you would normally see in the browser. And the really cool thing about this is if you were to do this with just JavaScript, you would probably need a lot of work to account for especially all of the interactions that happen just with the keyboard. So here I'm going to go ahead and tab through, and you can see that as I tab through, we get highlighting available on the tabbable elements, not to mention that I can actually tab to them. And then I can use the keyboard to highlight them and switch between different options. And I get all of that for free and with not a whole lot of work, just using HTML and CSS. And the amount of work it would take to recreate all that with JavaScript would be not only a lot, but probably not work as well, in addition to actually communicating that these are radios and checkboxes and how they work. So another example that you see frequently is like this sort of switch toggle component. And once again, very accessible, easy to get to with just the keyboard, and it communicates its state to assistive technology, which is pretty nice. Another one, I'm going to get out of the sort of interactive ones and just walk through some screen capture examples, but we can do something like this that looks totally different than an actual input, although we are asking for some user feedback. So here we have a question that's like, what's your favorite front-end language? And it gives 3 options, and because it's your favorite, you can only select one. So really, this is a UI that is completely different than what the browser makes available to us, but underneath it all, it behaves like a browser available primitive, which is the radio input, because you can select one option. So what you can have is a UI that looks like this and presents, a more nicer experience to users, but still has all the browser features, such as having a default state. Maybe once it's focused, you can highlight each different option, and then you can select one and have different styling accordingly. And again, we don't need JavaScript anymore to be able to accomplish this sort of UI. And it gets also interesting when we look at validation controls, because CSS has these pseudo classes you can tap into for validity. You can see whether an input is invalid or valid. In this case, we have the same input that has to have, it's like a required input. And when it's invalid, it has this red border, but we can obviously target this only when the user highlights it, so that it's not just a bunch of red inputs looking at them, but as they tab through, they can see that something is invalid. And once they meet the criteria, then they'll see the valid state. And the same can happen not just inline on individual inputs, but at the entire form level. So over on the right-hand side, we can see that we have one of those required checkboxes, and the form's submit button is grayed out until after you've selected the checkbox. That's because it's required, and you can do a CSS pseudo class selector on the form itself to see if it has any invalid inputs. Last but not least is this sort of conditional rendering thing. And this one's kind of interesting because the way it works is we have a select field set of a bunch of custom radio inputs. And when one is selected, it will not only show the selected state for that input, but somewhere else on the page, we can reveal information or reveal an element based on which input was selected. Now in this UI, we have an example where the revealed sort of content comes immediately after the checkboxes or the radio inputs, although technically with the has pseudo selector, we don't need to do that. You can target literally any other element on the page and show or hide it based on which one of these checkboxes or radio inputs is selected, which is really cool. But that also introduces an interesting conversation around accessibility. So I do want to showcase a little bit of some of the tools that I've used to walk through and create these examples. Some of them are these pseudo classes. CSS, I think, has 18 different pseudo classes that are related to or explicitly used for forms and inputs, but these 5 are the ones that I've found most useful. And then there's also custom classes that you might want to add and look into, like the visually hidden class that's used for hiding content from visual users, but still presenting that content to assistive technology. And then there are the combinator selectors, which are a fun way in CSS to target different elements based on parent-child relationships or sibling relationships. And lastly is the has pseudo selector, which is super, super powerful. It's pretty new, so it may not be ready for everyone's application depending on who your target audience is, but it's coming and it can do a whole lot, such as that conditional rendering. And I do have a couple of blog posts once again that I would like to share if you want to go into more detail about styling form elements specifically, or more specifically just about how the has pseudo selector can incorporate with forms to make them even more powerful. Okay, so now that we've kind of covered the pros and cons of just HTML and HTML plus CSS, it's time to talk about the getting JavaScript into the mix. And this is where we get into what I consider a little bit more of the fun stuff, because this is where we're starting to have the escalators and the dynamic programming stuff going on. JavaScript is a very fascinating programming language, specifically because you can do just about anything. Like anything that you need to do in the browser can be done with JavaScript. And it can kind of go to your head, and it feels a little bit like this, which is awesome because, I love making dynamic applications that are doing all sorts of whiz-bang stuff. Problem is, JavaScript also has its own fair set of weaknesses, because we're talking about things that the browser does for us. If we want to recreate those in JavaScript, that means more work that we may have to do that the browser may already have available. We also are asking users to download more information to run our JavaScript, and when they run our JavaScript, that potentially could use more resources on their end, especially if it's some sort of continual task. And now those resources could affect, especially on mobile devices, battery life. That could affect other processes that are running on their device that are competing for those same resources. Now, JavaScript also, compared to the other two front-end languages, is not nearly as forgiving. If you accidentally put a bug in your code, your application might just stop working at that point and not continue parsing afterwards. So pretty fickle in that regard. It's also not inherently bad for accessibility, but something about there does seem to be like a correlation between heavy JavaScript usage and poor accessibility. And lastly, as we mentioned before, for all of the reasons that JavaScript can fail, it's probably not quite as reliable. And all of these things start to make me feel a little bit more like this, which is fine because we can still do some stuff. We can still use it. But if we're going to use JavaScript to improve features that already exist in the browser, it's a good idea not to break other features. So let's say things like keyboard shortcuts, right? If you're going to add a keyboard shortcut to your application, it's probably a good idea not to override some of the existing keyboard shortcuts. So let's look at how that plays out with some of the features in forms. So we can talk about inputs, and we can say, well, with JavaScript, we can do a lot of really cool things like create inputs that can do the fancy sort of multi-select to add tags to a page or something like that. Or maybe we want a place that users can drop their files on. Even though they can do that with a file input, we might want to have a better experience where it's like a whole, like they can drop files on the entire page and it'll just be appended to the page or appended to the form. Or if you want to do something like a fancy date picker or time picker, we can do that with JavaScript because that's not available in HTML. I mean, there's a date picker available in HTML, but we might want to do things that the HTML alone can't do or CSS can't do. And another good example is the type ahead or auto suggest, where as you're typing into a field, you might get suggestions on how to fill that in. These are all good, really good examples that we can use JavaScript to improve the user experience of a form with. But we want to make sure that we're not breaking things, because as we're improving these inputs, it's easy to break actual functionality about how forms and inputs work under the hood. At the end of the day, you have to send this data over an HTTP request, most likely. And it's easy to add JavaScript that ends up breaking the underlying HTML that would otherwise work. Same with accessibility and accessible controls. We have to make sure in the example of making a clickable div that we want to make sure that you can reach the UX or UI controls or form controls with a keyboard, and that you can activate it and work with it. And in my opinion, because of the conditions, the network conditions, and the context in which JavaScript can fail, it's important to me that we build our applications in a way that they work with or without JavaScript, just because I know that I want my applications to be as resilient as possible, and the most important actions that I need users to take on a page most likely are going to be filling out some sort of form. I want that form to work whether they're at the airport or whether they have a spotty connection or whether they have some sort of ad blocker. So the other areas in building forms where I see a common pattern of using JavaScript is validation. And JavaScript is great for validation. We can do cool things that are not available in the browser by default. Such as providing custom error messages instead of having to deal with those kind of ugly, janky ones. We can also, by providing custom error messages, we can maybe use our own UI instead of relying on those pop-ups that may clash with our application. We can use our own custom divs or custom elements. We can also provide more immediate feedback because the native validation runs when a user tries to submit the form, but we might want to give them a better user experience by triggering some sort of validation message, either when they leave an input field or as they're typing, or maybe after they've made changes to an input. And last, although I was mentioning before that JavaScript can be bad for accessibility, it's not necessarily 100% the case. In fact, there's a lot of accessibility improvements that you can only do with JavaScript, such as toggling whether something is has the ARIA invalid HTML attribute, or whether something is disabled, or maybe you want to do some dynamic information on how the input is described or the element is described using ARIA described by. Now that said, while we're making improvements with our JavaScript to our forms, we want to be cognizant of the things that already exist in the browser by default that we don't want to break, such as native inputs that communicate very well what errors are happening on the page to assistive technologies. There's other features that the browser does by default with validation, such as scrolling to the first invalid input when you hit the submit button. Consider a form where you have a very long form that might be taller than the page, so you have a scrolling situation. Now, if you scroll to the bottom of the page and you hit submit and there's an error at the top of the page, you want to make sure that the user is going to see that error, and the browser does that by focusing on it and scrolling to it and then showing that default error state. So if we do that with JavaScript, we just want to make sure that we are accounting for that scenario as well, and that we aren't trampling on existing ARIA attributes. So just needing to be cognizant and thoughtful about how we are approaching this. And once again, validation is something that is a user improvement. It's not an application requirement. So if I have an issue with my JavaScript on the page, I don't want that validation tooling to prevent the user from being able to continue to use the application. So it should work with or without JavaScript pretty seamlessly. Okay, and then the last area that I see that we have available in the browser is making that form submission request or sending the HTTP request that submits the form data. And JavaScript, once again, is really nice to use to replace the existing behavior, because we can do things like add new features. Like, let's say a user can, or JavaScript can auto submit the form when a user makes a change. Such as if you're on your profile settings page and you click and you check a couple of checkboxes on that can modify your settings, you might want the browser to just send that HTTP request right away instead of requesting the user create a second action, which is toggle the checkbox and then submit the form. We can also make it a little bit nicer by supporting things like keyboard shortcuts. So if you've ever submitted, if you've ever been on an application where you compose a message in like a text area and then you can hit Control Enter to submit the form, that's not native behavior. That has to be customly injected with JavaScript, and that's just kind of a nice improvement to the user experience that works, or if JavaScript is not available, is not a big deal if it's not there. And lastly, probably the most familiar one is avoiding the page refresh. So by default, when you submit a form with HTML, the browser will reload the page or do some sort of navigation, and it can be a much nicer user experience and much faster, and also save the user some data if we use fetch instead to make the HTTP request. Now, all of these examples prevent a lot of other scenarios or touch on a lot of other scenarios or issues that we could accidentally break. So nice features that exist in the browser that we don't want to break. So for example, if we avoid the page reload using fetch, we've now introduced the possibility for a user to just spam the submit button and click it several times. There's also a lot of interesting issues around the content type headers when you submit a form. And you just want to make sure that when you are enhancing your applications and making these submissions using fetch, that you're respecting the same content type. And this is mostly important because of how requests are handled on the back end. So whether you control the back end or not, you want to make sure that you are sending the appropriate content types and that the data is sent in a way that the back end knows how to deal with it. And then once the back end sends a response, in some cases, a backend API or server might want to tell the browser, hey, I got it, here's the data, we're all good, but I want you to redirect to this page. And if you're using a fetch request to enhance your form submissions, you may want to account for that because that doesn't happen by default. It also, by default, doesn't handle server errors. When the fetch request receives a status code from the server that says the server received an error, the browser doesn't know what to do with that. So you may want to account for that in your application. Once again, being mindful and respectful of any sort of existing keyboard shortcuts. And once again, this all, in my opinion, should work with or without JavaScript. Okay, so with those sort of topics out of the way, I've been mostly diplomatic, but now I think I'm going to get into some of my sort of spicy takes. just something to chew on, is you don't need state management for your form inputs. I don't see why some people will choose to use something like a use state and do the song and dance in React to make controlled inputs, when really the browser has its own state management sort of built in, where as a user types into an input field, that data gets saved in the browser. And unless you're doing something to the rest of the application based on what they type at that moment, you probably don't need state management. You can just let the form sort of submit that data as it needs. I also don't believe that JSON is a great use case for submitting form data, because the browser, once again, has some ways that it can send data on its own, built in using HTML, and that is the URL search parameters or the body as multi-part form data. And JSON, unfortunately, it's required that JavaScript is available in order to send data using JSON, which means at the moment that you decide that your API is going to accept JSON only, or that you're going to only send data as JSON, you're already assuming that your application is not going to work without JavaScript. And I don't see much benefit to that when you can just use built-in primitives. You also probably don't need custom fetch requests for every single endpoint. This is another thing that I see a lot of applications do, which is every single form on the page has its own custom submit handler that prevents default behavior and then sends the data to a custom endpoint. And that's not really necessary. You can build your application in such a way that it can use just the same fetch request or fetch handler or submit event handler. I also feel the same for fancy validation libraries. Client-side validation is a user experience feature. It's not a security feature. So the fact that the built-in validation is limited is unfortunate, but if you require a fancy validation library, you're basically punishing the user in terms of performance and what they have to download for the sake of something that isn't going to cover your butt anyway. You always have to validate information on the back end. And so why not just use the built-in validation tools? Also, as far as fancy libraries go, I don't think you need a fancy HTTP library. Fetch works wonderfully. You can create a wrapper around Fetch that does all the work that you need and is much more lightweight. And once again, you can do it in such a way that it works with your forms without having to need a custom fetch implementation for every form. So instead of all those things, the approach that I found that has worked really well for me is to really embrace and understand and learn and use the powers that HTML and CSS already have and play and just like shine a light on them, play to their strengths. And you can let that HTML, the forms, provide the declarative information about how the HTTP request should be submitted. And the same goes for validation on individual inputs. You can use the built-in validation attributes and have JavaScript kind of step in after the page has loaded and read the information off of the existing tags, including submission information and validation information, and kind of enhance the form in such a way that it makes those existing features even better. And this allows you to, by relying on HTML to provide the declarative rules, you can create a JavaScript abstraction that can work across any form on your entire page and can handle the validation and the submission and make it all work really well when JavaScript is available. And then by constructing that information off of what's there in the HTML, when JavaScript is not available, it will still work as expected with with a good enough set of features, not the enhanced experience. And then the last thing here is you get to really relax when you build things this way because it's a lot more bulletproof. The reason is that HTML forms have worked literally for decades, and it will continue to work for decades because the browser generally is a backwards compatible feature that doesn't introduce breaking changes. And although that does apply to JavaScript in general, modern JavaScript encourages us to reach for libraries for so many of the tools that we maybe don't even need. And the problem is these libraries might even break with minor upgrades. It's happened to me, and I don't like when my stuff breaks. But if it's going to, at least falling back to HTML to submit forms and do that validation and do the things that it has built in, and to use CSS when I can, it means that I can write less JavaScript, parse less JavaScript, ask the user to download less JavaScript, and I can only use it to sort of improve the existing experience. So there's one more blog post here that I want to share called, Make Beautifully Resilient Apps with Progressive Enhancement. That was a fun one to write. But there's one other thing that we haven't really discussed, and that is, so far we've only talked about the things using JavaScript to sort of enhance features that already exist in the browser. And that's where progressive enhancement makes sense. I mean, if we're talking about just recreating existing things that HTML and CSS kind of already have, sure, they provide some level of superpowers, but it really doesn't pay respect to JavaScript's strengths, and that is sort of, all of the other cool stuff that we can do. So instead of focusing on the things that rebuilding the things that the browser already has, what if we looked at some of the things that we can only do with JavaScript that has no analogous feature in the other languages? And that's things like input masks, right? As a user types, let's say you want a phone number or credit card and something that has a very specific sort of structure or display. Input masks are really awesome, and they're a way for users to be able to type something more loosely and then have JavaScript format it in the right way so that your application can receive it and it sort of can look better. It adds a much nicer user experience, and it's just like an all-around nice feature to add. Another one is having repeater fields. So what a repeater field might do is take a group of inputs and have you append more clones of those groups of inputs to the page, so you basically can repeat the same thing, the same questions for several fields. So let's say if it's your job history, you might need the name of the place you worked, how many years, what you did there, and you might want to do that for multiple different jobs that you've had. It's not necessarily easy or trivial, but you can do that with JavaScript that you cannot do with HTML. The other one is reordering things. So let's say that same example of submitting your job history and you got things out of order, or you remember one late. Being able to drag and drop sort of and repositioning things is a nice feature that you can enhance an existing application with things that it couldn't do otherwise necessarily, but can be done with JavaScript. Another interesting use case is doing something like client-side file manipulation. So if you wanted to modify a user's form entries before they actually send it to the backend, you could do that. So let's say file manipulation might be take a file that they are trying to upload, and if it is too large and will fail any sort of backend file size constraints, you could maybe modify that file and shrink it before it gets uploaded, and do that all on the client side in a way that they can avoid dealing with server-side errors, or they can avoid having an error message that comes back and says, oh, sorry, that file's too big, and just kind of improves not only the experience, but then in that case could improve storage costs for your application. Another interesting one is detect if a field has been touched. There are some things that are coming to CSS that might make this a little bit easier, but basically today there's not a good way to know without JavaScript whether a user has focused on an input and then left focus. There's ways to know whether it's invalid or not, but whether a user has modified it can only be detected with JavaScript. Another one is dynamic validation. So having the validation constraints be modified based on user interaction. So a good example of this is if a user is creating a new account and they need to put in a password, and there's two inputs, and the second password input just has to match the first one. You can't do that with HTML alone necessarily. You could maybe do that with a whole round trip to the server and check it, but that would be really annoying. So the nice thing is you can do it on the client side by just having a listener that makes sure that those are in sync. And you can do a lot more to improve the user experience around preventing data loss. So consider any time that you've accidentally reloaded the page or navigated away from the page or hit the back button or something like that, and then you lose all of the information and all the time that you spent filling out the form. There's a really excellent user experience improvement that you can do by telling JavaScript to confirm with the user that they want to navigate away from the page prior to doing so. Another nice feature is supporting retries. Let's say if the user is experiencing some network issues and they submit the form when their network is down, you might want to add some sort of logic with JavaScript that is not available in the browser that once again could try submitting the form, and in the event of a bad request, maybe it takes a little bit of time off and tries submitting the form again instead of having to let the user know that, you know, the page broke or something. And last but not least, a really cool example of something that you might consider to add superpowers to your forms is providing support for offline behavior. So if a user is trying to submit something offline, maybe you let them know that they're offline, but you can store the information, and when they come back online, you can try and submit the request on their behalf. Of course, you want to be careful with all of these solutions that you're doing them in a way that is accessible and secure. You maybe don't want to always store very private information for use later on if it's something like a credit card and the user may be logged into a public computer like a library. Okay, so all of those things are really cool, really awesome features that you can implement in your forms to give them superpowers. And here is a list of all of the sort of APIs, events, and properties or methods that I have found particularly helpful when I've been walking through building a lot of forms myself in a way that kind of follows this progressive enhanced approach. And yeah, you can get really far without needing custom libraries. Now, I should say that all of those sort of spicy takes that I mentioned before, they all have their own exceptions to the rules. Of course, if your application is primarily something like picking dates or needing some sort of fancy validation, there are scenarios where you can opt into that, and it makes sense to do that. But those costs should be weighed against the benefit that it's going to bring the user. If the user is going to benefit greatly from, you know, having some custom HTTP request library, great, do it. As long as the benefits outweigh the cost. So I want to thank you for hanging out and listening to me today. I really like talking about forms. I really like talking about progressive enhancement. I really love HTML and CSS and JavaScript. And I would love to connect with you as well at any of these sort of social channels. I do live streaming and YouTube stuff. So these are all the places you can find me. I'd also love to know if you could let me know how I did on this talk. If you learned something, there's that link in the top left just to kind of ping me on Twitter and let me know. And then lastly, I want to give a shout out once again to my company, Akamai. We acquired Linode a little while ago. So if you want, I do have a short code there that's going to give you $100 in credit if you want to give it a try. And yeah, be great to do that. If you do, let me know. I'd love to connect with you and talk to you more. And if you have questions, I have a lot more things to say about forms and all this stuff. So I'd love to connect with you.
This is all we got. Remember the revolution in our minds. This is all we got. Lock me out of this life institution. I am angry and I am illusions. Yes, I hate, but it's not a solution. Try my best, but I'm just a human. Oh, we don't need to say we're sorry. We don't need to worship heaven's stars.